All right, hello everybody. We're outside today. It's a beautiful Friday, October 1st here in Calgary, Alberta. I'm awaiting your third homework submissions, and I'm just going to give you a brief walkthrough here about how to do homework number 4 as you're wrapping up the last bits of that. So homework number 4 is due on October 8th, next Friday at 5 p.m., and it's about two things. Number one, sampling, and then also confidence intervals. And just so you know, there are two parts to this. There's 2 pages, so please don't overlook the second part of this as well, but I'm going to walk you through that by the end of this video. The first part, like I said, is about sampling. And so the way we start with this one is that I've created a F0 database from the recordings you sent me for the first homework. So if you go through data sets and then the link down here, 2021 class F0 for homework number 4, you'll get this data frame here. And basically I took all the recordings you sent me, and you're focusing on VOT at the time you made those, but I just automatically extracted F0 measurements from them using prot. So that winds up being quite a lot of F0 measurements. Those of you who have been trying to type in the data into vectors using that arrow and the C kind of combine command are not going to be able to do this that way. You're going to have to do it in a much simpler way using sort of the syntax of the R commands that I've been showing you all the way through this. But there's a lot of data in here. It's the individual specific details aren't quite as important as sort of the overall patterns we can see in it. But the first thing you need to do is load that into your R console, and then I want you to calculate and report the mean and standard deviation of that entire population of F0 measurements. So what we're going to do is pretend that this is like a population of some interest, like these are all the F0 measures in the world that we care about for, say, this group of people doing this task. These are the only ones that exist. So that's the entire population. We don't normally find ourselves in that sort of situation, but we're going to have to pretend just for the sake of doing this exercise. So first thing first, you calculate the mean and standard deviation of that population of F0 measurements. And then I want you to generate different sampling distributions, basically. So there's going to be 3 different sampling distributions that you'll create. Each one is going to have 100 samples each, and then you're going to have different number of observations in the samples for each of the 3 different distributions. So for the first one, you just take 16 observations in each sample. For the second one, you take 256 observations in each sample. And for the last one, you take 4,096 observations in each sample. And if these numbers seem kind of funny to you, well, once you start to do the math that's involved with this exercise, it might become a little clearer why I'm picking these numbers. But taking the square roots of these numbers winds up giving you a nice kind of even number. Anyways, the point is that people often get confused about what exactly this entails. So when I say 100 samples of each of the following sizes, that means there's 100 samples here, there's 100 samples here, and there's 100 samples here. So there's 300 samples total, but each set of 100 has a different number of observations in each sample. So for this one, you're taking sample 1 has 16 observations, then sample 2 has 16 observations, so on and so forth. Likewise, in this one, sample 1 has 256 observations, sample 2 has 256 observations, so on and so forth. Okay, so we wind up with 3 sets of 100 samples each, and then within each sample, there's a different number of observations. But what I want you to do is, for each of the individual samples here, for each of these 300 samples, you should calculate the mean of that sample and store those means in a vector. That vector is now going to form a quote-unquote sampling distribution of the sampling means. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can kind of go back to the lecture notes that I gave you, or the R commands I gave you on sampling. I think it's in here. Yeah, so these are the crucial notes that will help you in this regard. So they link up to here. They're labeled September 16th, 2021. They're unchanged from 2 years ago, so they're slightly different number or date there, where it's September 17th, 2019. But anyways, this walks you through the sampling process about how to do this. And in the crucial part of it winds up being down here in part 4, where I show you how to do individual samples, and then also a loop where you can do multiple samples of the same type for an individual population. And then you set up a vector this way, so on and so forth, and you can calculate means and whatnot, and put those all into the same vector and then play around with them. So if you haven't looked through those command notes already, be sure you do that because it's going to be immensely helpful for doing this exercise. Once you've got those means in separate vectors for each 3 of these sampling distributions, I want you to use R to calculate the observed mean and standard deviation of each of these sampling distributions. So there's basically you wind up with the mean of means and then like a standard deviation of those means. And since we're taking the standard deviation of samples from a larger population, we can call that the standard error. And that means that the central limit theorem is going to apply as well. So the next task you have here is to compare the observed standard error of those sampling distributions to the value of the standard error that would be predicted by the central limit theorem for that sampling distribution. I'm not going to explain exactly how to do that in this video, but I've walked you through enough steps in other videos and lecture notes so that you would actually know how to do this, so you can figure out the answer if it's not immediately clear what you're doing right here. But the one thing that people often get tripped up on is what I mean by observed versus predicted. And so basically what I mean by observed is you're generating sampling distributions of means for each 3 of these sets of data, and then those sampling distributions will have their own standard deviations. So those standard deviations you can think of as the standard error of those sampling distributions, and in particular that's an observed standard error. That's a standard error that you actually calculate based on data you've collected from the sampling process. There's a different sort of standard error that would be predicted by the central limit theorem for those sampling distributions, and you can base that on the population standard deviation and how many observations you have in these samples. And if you don't understand that, walk through the notes on the central limit theorem again, but those are 2 separate things. What you get directly from these sampling distributions and what you get indirectly from this population and the predictions made by the central limit theorem. That's what you're trying to compare here. And to compare them, I want you to directly answer the question, which observed standard error is closest to the predicted standard error and which is furthest away? And then you can also answer which sampling distribution mean is closest to the population mean, because the central limit theorem makes predictions about that relationship as well. Okay, so plot a histogram. The next step is plot a histogram of the entire set of F0 measures, which is up here. And then plot histograms for each of the sampling distributions in A through C, which is basically the means you get out of this sampling process. And then take a look at those 4 distributions and tell me which one is the most normal and which one is the least. At this point, we haven't come up with a way to directly quantify how normal a distribution is, so you're just going to kind of have to eyeball it. In this set of commands, though, I've walked you through a process of how to kind of get a better idea of how normal a distribution is. It involves these commands, and there's actually a video here, the R commands number 3 video for normal distributions, which walks you through that process, how that works as well. You can find it in the how-to videos, our number 3 R commands normal distributions. So that will help you, or should help you a little bit in answering those questions. But otherwise, that's all you have to do for that part. So for this problem, write up your answers into a short report, save both your R workspace and R console, and send those to me via the Dropbox on D2L. And one of the reasons I want you to save your R workspace is because everybody's sampling distributions are going to be a little bit different. So I can't recreate what you got out of those just by myself, because it's a random selection process, right? I need to have that workspace so I know exactly what data you were playing around with when you did this exercise. And then also send me your graphics files for the 4 plots. I think we know how to do that by now. Otherwise, that's it for part number 1. For part number 2, it's about the second half of this, which is confidence intervals. Okay, so I basically want you to calculate generate a few confidence intervals, and this time we're going to go back and work with this VOT data, which we've played around with before. If I can find it in here, it's not that one. It's in here somewhere. It's this one. Yeah. So class VOT 2021. We've seen this stuff before, and we're still going to split it up for the 3 different places of articulation, because we know that those 3 places of articulation have an effect on the VOT that we observe in this data set. So what you're going to do, you'll split up the data by place of articulation. Then for each place of articulation, you're going to grab independent samples of 20 observations from those places of articulation. And then for those samples, so you have 3 different samples here, and then for each of those samples, you're going to generate 3 confidence intervals. And those confidence intervals will be 60%, 80%, and 90% confidence intervals. And if you need a review or a refresher on how to calculate confidence intervals, they come in this other set of R commands, which is here, dated September 28th, which is just a couple days ago. And this gives you the basics of how to walk through that process for your samples in this exercise. Once you've calculated those, and remember they're different percentages, 3 for each place of articulation. Number 1, state the values you derive for each confidence interval, and also whether each confidence interval includes the mean of the population you have sampled from. So in this case, when I'm saying population, I just mean like the population of all the bilabial stops in this database, or the population of all the alveolar stops in this database, so on and so forth. So just consider this data set as like a population itself, which can be split up into 3 different places of articulation. And then again, I want you to save your workspace and your console for this problem, and then submit them to me along with this in a write-up via the Dropbox on D2L, and then you're basically done. So it's a little bit involved, but probably not as involved as the last exercise, which a lot of you are still working on. But yeah, hopefully this all makes sense, and if it doesn't, you know where to find me if you need to ask questions. That's it. I'll see you again next week.